Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and as most of you know, I'm actually an associate professor here at Kyoto University, where I'm on a research contract to investigate my topic of neutrality studies as an academic discipline. The other day, I was invited to Seijo University in Tokyo to give a talk about my field of study and why, as part of that, I'm running this very YouTube channel here. So I did that, and after the event, the organizer, my friend and colleague Dennis Riches, told me that it might also be interesting for some of you here to know more about the background of academic neutrality studies and how I came to start a YouTube channel in the first place. So here we are. I'm sharing the recording of the presentation with you in the hope it adds some more clarity about how this all goes together. Many thanks to Dennis and his team for hosting this event, and here you go. My name is Pascal Lottaz, and I lead two lives. On the one hand, I'm at Kyoto University, and I lead a research group called Neutrality Studies, and I've been engaged in this academic project of neutrality studies for the last at least 8 or so years. I did my PhD here in Japan. I started in 2014, and around 2015, I found my topic, and in 16 I realized I don't understand my topic. So I found neutrality. I'm a Swiss, and as a Swiss, neutrality is something that we talk about every single day. It's something like, not we talk about it every single day, we don't, but it's just with us. It's just the most natural thing in the world that we think of ourselves as neutral. It's kind of the way that the word freedom would be intimately connected to you as Americans, or how I hear from a lot of Americans, freedom is a very important way and a myth of identity. And so for the Swiss, the neutrality is an important part and myth of identity, which is why I wasn't interested at all in it until my advisor here in Tokyo told me, Pascal, we don't really know what the neutral embassies did in Japan during the Second World War. We just don't know. And his name is Kitaoka Shinichi, is a good historian, and he knows a lot. And he said, we don't know what that one is. So he said, okay, let me look into that for a term paper. And turns out that indeed, this was kind of a mysterious part of the relationship between neutral European states and Japan. And so I ended up looking at Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, because all three were neutral, and all three had a relationship with Japan, even at the height of the war and until the very end. And that was fascinating. And then something hit me that was even more fascinating, which is that Sweden and Switzerland were two neutrals, look similar on the outside, function differently on the inside, and they had a very similar relationship with Japan. But Spain too. Spain was a dictatorship under Francisco Franco, just finished a bloody civil war in 1939 after 3 years, and then a bloody dictatorship, and they had a relationship with Japan. And those three states actually started collaborating during the war, because the Japanese, the Germans, the Americans asked them to do that. And they did collaborate, and they did very similar things for the belligerents, and they upheld a diplomatic system for the belligerents during the war. And that's when it hit me that there's not only things that we don't know yet about the Second World War, there's also things we don't understand about how neutral actors interact with each other during wars. So I then made the decision to try to look more systematically into this topic of neutrality, and out of that grew my idea that let's just call this neutrality studies. Let me study neutrality systematically, and when I understood how many things could be studied at how deep a level, not just the Second World War, the First World War, the Cold War, the 19th century, 18th, 17th, maritime neutrality, land neutrality, warfare, permanent neutrality. There's so many that I said, okay, I call this the study of neutrality, and I'm going to try to do this with other people, because if I do it alone, I'm never going to get very far. I need input of others, not just the ones that already wrote books and articles, but still the books and articles to come in order to understand this better. So I did, in a sense, what I'm trying to do at the moment is to do what Dennis is doing with history. by claiming that there is neutrality studies, I hope that others pick it up, and if enough people do that, then it will be there. And if they don't, it will not exist. So I'm in the moment at the point where I'm trying to experiment on whether or not I can establish a thing, and if I can make others pick it up. And one of the things that I've started doing is, well, I create a homepage and I reach out to colleagues and we do conferences together. So we had a Neutrality Studies conference in October, and Dennis was there, and Alex and Brad, and everybody gave, people did presentations, and we had very fruitful, I think, intellectual and academic exchange. On the other hand, I have my online life in which I have a YouTube channel, also called Neutrality Studies. And on the one hand, this YouTube channel is also an approach of me just trying to assert that this thing exists and have people in the online space on social media pick it up. On the other hand, it's also just laziness, because this thing started 6-7 years ago just as a place to put webinars. I just organized webinars with people who gave talks about their research, and I put that there just to park it, to have it somewhere. Until about 3 years ago, when I realized that webinars are lovely and nice, but they are hard to organize, and then you have a few people who show up and you have a long discussion and Q&A, and later on it lives on the internet and gets watched 10, 20, 30 times maybe. And that's nice, it's okay. But if I talk to people one-on-one, I have 1 hour, I can interview and I can ask deeper questions to these people, and I might get more interesting outcomes for myself. And then, if I share that with people, and if I make these interviews and share that on the internet, then maybe people will be willing to talk to me. And my calculation was correct. I started reaching out to different academics and intellectuals, to diplomats, to politicians. And just by saying in an email, "Hi, I have a YouTube channel. Would you be willing to talk to me?" most people started saying yes, including people like Mr. Jack Matlock, the United States' last ambassador to the Soviet Union. So I got to interview him. I got to interview people like Chas Freeman, former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and the Nixon's principal translator when Nixon went to China to normalize relations, and a very brilliant critic of current U.S. affairs. And that way I got to just also expand the network of people that I could talk to and learn from and ask them honest questions. It's also something that I also tell my students. When you write a term paper, especially when a thesis, try to ask a real question, not a rhetorical one. Not, how some people start with, should Russia have invaded Ukraine in 2022? I say, well, you're not asking a question. You're setting up your own thesis, right? You're setting up yourself toward getting to the conclusions where you want to get to. The opposite of that is real questions. It's like, how come that we, at the moment, find so much common narration about the Ukraine war in Western media? How come that there's so much agreement on the causes of this war if you look at major newspapers? And then I ask this to different people, and then you get different answers. This is also where we then get into this issue of myths in society and narratives. And one of the things that I've come to understand is that we have several problems in international relations. Ultimately, on the one hand, I also think I'm a bit of a historian. On the other hand, I do international relations. But my main issue is I would like to understand how we work. And there's some fundamentals important to recognize. First, that we are an 8 billion planet. We're 8 billion people on a little marble cruising through outer space, and we have to self-organize. I assert this. I mean, as a theologian, you might disagree. I mean, if there is a God and God gave us principles, then we don't self-organize. Then we organize according to the principles. But if we conceptualize ourselves as independent from a first universal principle other than the natural principles that we have to adhere to, like gravity and maybe evolution and so on, we have to self-organize as a species, right? And for some reason, this species starts killing itself, especially the larger the groups get. And this is a scary thing to do, because ultimately I don't know a lot of species that do that massively kill their own, right? I mean, even lions, they occasionally kill each other, but they usually do so over rivalries and territory, and then it's fine. But we do this massively, and we developed the capacity, the technological capacity to kill all of us. We have today the means that if a few people push a few buttons, we will all die. And that is a stupid thing to do for a species. That's just a dumb thing. Even from an evolutionary point of view, that's fascinating. This is a must be an emergent property that comes out of the complexity of the system. Now, understanding this system, I think, is what international relations is supposed to do, to study us on the very big macro level. And one. This is a long story to come to my tiny little topic. One of these phenomena of how groups work and how we self-organize is that when we find conflict, there's never a conflict in which everybody is on one side and everybody on the other. There's always third parties. And these third parties ought to be studied. And that is what this neutrality study is about. And when I start with saying I have these two lives, it's like the YouTube channel is not only about neutrality and neutrality studies. The YouTube channel is also mostly about geopolitical analysis, especially of people who I agree with, because I choose them, right? So I do bias my channel. And a lot of comments in my channel are often, but this is not neutral at all. It's like, yeah, but I don't claim to be neutral. I claim to study neutrality. I have never met a cancer researcher who's a cancer. I've never met a biologist who's himself a plant. Okay, so I study this phenomenon. I'm not neutral, I'm a neutralist. I do think that the phenomenon of neutrality, of third-party politics, has something to contribute to not only to the way that the system works, but if we use these tools correctly, then maybe we can influence this 8 billion system that we set up in a productive way, or in a way that maybe runs on less violence. I mean, that's the overall hope of the thing. And I can talk more about this YouTube channel and how it helps me, because it helps me in many, many different ways and has been very beneficial so far. But when it comes to then the concrete issue that I would like to inject into academic discourse and also global discourse about it, it's kind of something that bothers me, and it goes together with something that maybe we have later time to talk about. It goes into this propaganda issue, is the way that neutrality is being perceived, or the stereotypes of neutrality. And they don't bother me necessarily because I'm Swiss. They bother me now because I understand the Swiss understanding, or the understanding of neutrality as being what the Swiss do is part of the problem. It's not, and it's a problem because it's not only a exceptional case of how neutrality works, it's also the most boring way how neutrality works. There's so many more interesting ways that this phenomenon shows itself that if I show them to you, you might agree that they are way more interesting than what Switzerland is about. And so there's two main problems with the stereotypes about neutrality. One is that it means doing nothing. The first cartoon, right, from SpongeBob, World War III breaks out, and Switzerland on its to-do list has nothing, and it's even done with that one. So that the stereotype that neutrality means you don't do anything. You're a passive observer of what happens around you, and you yourself are sitting still. And for various reasons, that is almost never the case. The second inherently unhelpful stereotype, and I don't think this is on purpose, this is just the way that we try to, we need metaphors, we need ways to understand abstract concepts, and neutrality is an abstract concept. This metaphor of the weighing scale is inherently unhelpful. I'm very glad that people realize that the 12th of December is the International Day of Neutrality, United Nations Day of Neutrality. We have that since 2017, thanks to, yes, Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is the country that made sure the United Nations declared their Day of Neutrality. They received their neutrality legally recognized by the UN on the 12th of December 1995, and they really pushed for it and said, until the UN agreed, okay, fine, let's have a Day of Neutrality. So we have that thing now. But so I'm glad about that. But that it is depicted with a weighing scale where the idea is, okay, you're neutral, you're in between. This camouflages so much of what the actual dynamic is of neutrality that I would like to correct. And my main claim in my articles and my work is that neutrality is anywhere and everywhere a reaction to conflict. And I keep telling my students that the larger I write something on my slides, the more likely it will appear in an exam or somewhere. And I keep writing this very, very boldly everywhere. And what I mean with that is that in one way or another, conflict is the fundamental premise upon which neutrality rests. And if we understand conflicts and the natures of conflict, then we can deduce what we mean with this word neutrality and then how it how it reacts or how neutrality reacts with conflict. This is where I keep emphasizing that if we have a belligerent one or conflict party one and belligerent two, conflict party two, the whole point is that when they land in a conflict, wars are just the worst or one of the worst forms of conflict, then imagining that the neutral party A sits in the middle, balancing between the two, is ultimately bad for us because it camouflages that inherently the relationship between these actors is actually a triangle, it's not a line. The whole point is that all of these actors interact with each other, and the fundamental issue is that neutral actor A is inherently at peace with B1 and at peace with B2, while B1 and B2 are at war with each other. And this gives rise to so many problems. And this is not just for international relations. I mean, just think about kids fighting, and both kids will try to convince the parents that they are right and that the other one started it. And parents then have to be very, very careful in order not to make the situation worse. Right, and this is an inherent dynamic of conflict, and this is why if we go to conflict studies, we actually find people who drill into this concept. But one of the problems we have in academia is that neutrality is being studied separately. So we have conflict studies who study the general dynamic. We have historians who study individual instances. We have anthropologists who look at tribes and so on. We have international relations, which mainly ignores it and replaces it by other concepts like balancing, hedging, bandwagoning, and strategic autonomy, multi-vector diplomacy. They use every imaginable term under the sun, just not this one, to engage with the topic. And this is where I think that it would make sense to have the study of neutrality as a field in order to bring these strains together and understand the phenomenon as a phenomenon, and then make it useful in these different areas. But let's put that aside again. So the fascinating thing about if we conceptualize neutrality as a triangle issue, or the neutral actor as the third pole in a triangle, is that the neutrality itself actually emerges only secondarily. Right? The primary actors are the actors. Then the primary connection between them is either at peace or at war, and I mean, or in conflict, in harmony, whatever you want to call it. And neutrality itself only emerges as a reaction to the conflict, because neutral actor A will try to maintain distance from the conflict. The parents will try to remain at an arm's length of the actual problem between the kids, and will try to be optimally, they will try to be on both kids' side and tell them, look, I understand you and I understand you, but we got to work this out, right? And this is what this then leads to is that, of course, B1 and B2, in any war, the most natural thing to happen is that they try to put pressure on neutrals to be closer on their side. You can see that right now in the war between Russia and Ukraine is a very difficult example because we have conflict going on several levels. We have a hot shooting war between Russia and Ukraine. We have a cold structural war between Russia and NATO further allies. We have a smaller conflict going on between the Donbas republics and Ukraine, right? We have, as so often, actual warfare happens on various levels. But if we split those levels up, we will find how actors then approach this. And for instance, Switzerland, my home country, has decided that since it is officially neutral, right, it will remain neutral in the hot shooting war, and it refrained from sending weapons to Ukraine because that would be, according to international law, that's not okay. So they stayed away from that. But in the cold structural war between Russia and NATO, they did pick a side, and they said, yeah, we are going to put sanctions on Russia as well. And then the Russians reacted to that, saying, like, Switzerland, you're not neutral anymore. We don't recognize you as a neutral, even though the Swiss keep saying, but we are neutral. You should recognize us as neutral because we are not sending weapons. The Russians are saying, like, well, that's not what we are mostly interested in. You're picking a side on the with others. I mean, look, the Russians are pointing to other states like China, like India, like ASEAN countries, which don't send weapons and don't put sanctions, right? So from the Russian perspective, the China and India are way more neutral than the Swiss. The Swiss will shake their heads and say, like, oh, but that doesn't make any sense. I mean, they never declared neutrality. It's like, okay, fine. We have also conceptual confusion about what we mean. So when I talk about neutrality in this largest sense that I'm presenting to you here, I'm not speaking just of neutrality under international law or as a declared policy, but I'm speaking of neutrality as an analytical category to approach third-party states that try to maintain, in one way or another, a distance from from the conflict of two of their friends. And one of the things that I try to establish here is that we should recognize that while neutral actor A is maintaining, even if it maintains successful neutrality toward the conflict, the neutral actor is actually caught inside what I call a conflict constellation. And that's this thing. That's the fact that there is tension in this entire system, and that B1 and B2 will try to put pressure on A. And this happens time and again, First World War, Second World War, all the time. Both of the actors will tell neutrals, you have to be on our side. Indeed, in the most outrageous example, they will even say they will threaten them with violence, and they might even invade them. Right? Sometimes neutral actors get invaded because one of the belligerents says, like, oh, they're helping the other one too much. That's what happened to Tehran, to Iran. Iran got invaded by the Soviet Union and Britain. Soviet Union and Britain invaded Iran because they said, Iran, you're trading too much oil with the Germans. So we're going to take you. That's why we had one of the important, conferences of the Second World War was the Tehran Conference. Why? Not because Iran joined the war, because it got invaded by the Allies. And it's one of the little details of history that often fall by the wayside. But in any case, long story short, we have neutrals are caught in a conflict constellation, and usually how I try to also illustrate this is with the thought experiment of the man in the moon. Just imagine for 1 second that the man in the moon actually existed. We have the moon, and on the other side of the moon, the one that's never facing Earth, there's a little person living there, and that person is a real human, but the real human looks out into the universe and always sees the other side of the universe, right? The man in the moon doesn't know the Earth exists. The man in the moon doesn't know countries exist. The man in the moon doesn't know about Russia and Ukraine, and certainly doesn't know about the war between them. Would we intuitively call the man in the moon neutral? I would argue that we wouldn't do so, because the man in the moon lacks all and every information in order to make a choice. And actually under international law too. International law requires knowledge of the conflict in order for neutrality to take place to occur in the first place. So knowledge about the conflict is actually required in order for the concept of neutrality to make sense. The man in the moon would be simply uninvolved, outside of the realm of the conflict constellation, hence not neutral, but not neutral in the sense of unneutral, neutral in the sense of just outside of what this term can logically or possibly refer to. Which is why also, we know that France and Britain had wars in the 13th century. They did, and we know the Inca Empire existed in the 13th century. But describing the Inca Empire as neutral when they had zero knowledge about each other would just make no sense. So we only talk about neutrals about parties who somehow position themselves on their own side, so not on the side of one, not on the side of the other, but on their own side, which is one of the reasons why I keep saying thinking of neutrals as actors who do nothing at all just is again camouflage is the fact that they have to do a lot. They have first and foremost to take a decision to not support one or the other, or to support both of them, or to support one more than the other, but not as much as they would like to. So it's inherently part of this entire system that structures itself. And if you would like to have my definition of neutrality, I think the ancient and first historian, who is usually given that title, Thucydides, who chronicled the wars, the Greek wars. He put it very well when he said, actually in the discourse on Melos, almost in this, he said it slightly differently. I paraphrased it a tiny little bit, but he says, the neutrals are friends to all and foe to neither, being friends to both parties while not being at war with either. So I think this is a very, very useful way of thinking of the neutral position. And if you want to put it into Twitter terms, I would call it, this is hashtag not my war. And yes, this is then where the whole discussion about is that a moral position arises. Is that a good position to have? Can you, when absolute evil, when evil reigns, can you just be neutral toward it? And I have a lot to say about the moral framing, but the bottom line, because we don't have that much time, the bottom line is I reject it. The moral framing leaves no space for neutrality at all, because if war and violence is always a contest between good and evil, between the devil and the angel, then obviously there's no being in between. But if we use the framework of the realist school, and like Mr. Where is he? Mr. von Clausewitz. Where is he? Come on. Sorry, ignore this. Mr. von Clausewitz, who coined the phrase that war is the continuation of politics by other means. If you think of war as a way to get politically what you want, then under his framework there's much more space for neutrality, because then neutrality is the continuation. Of politics by the same means. So while the belligerents go to war to get what they want, the neutrals keep doing what they've been doing with peaceful tools with their partners while the others are at war. Then usually the attack on the neutrals is like, oh, but how dare you? I mean, obviously the other one was evil. And then usually the neutral has to tell them, that's what the other guy told me too about you. And it's like, oh, but he's lying, obviously. That's propaganda. Yeah, that's what he told me about you. and so on and so forth. And even if you go to the US, there's all of this, the neutrals, they were in breach of the Trading with the Enemy Act. Yeah, your enemy, not the neutral's enemy. And this is something that right now we see playing out again in the public discourse when, for instance, India is being criticized at the moment. Why do you take oil from Russia? when Russia is obviously in breach of international law and is attacking Ukraine. I mean, you should put sanctions on Russia, not taking their oil. And India says, like, look, their foreign minister literally said in an interview in front of a relatively large audience, he had to explain to this anchor, to the person who interviewed him, look, I represent over 1 billion people. I think I'm entitled to my own position in this entire thing, and to do what's good for India. I don't have to either do what is good for Russia nor what's good for the United States. I do what's good for me. And it's this typical way how a third-party actor would try to explain itself to these belligerent parties. And we can talk more about the dynamic that this then creates. But so this is that framing that I would like to that I'm developing, and that I think has a lot to offer, especially in a multipolar world that we are going into now, and that we are in at the moment. And this is part of also what I do on my channel. I try to understand what the world that we are currently in looks like. And as historians, we have the great advantage that the world we look at has passed, is gone, and we can dispassionately, with cold blood, just analyze what happened. We can go into the archives, we can read these documents. They're the ones that we find, the ones that are there. They give us information about what the system looked like at that point. But right now, as we speak, and as we experience history passing by, right, as we are part of the history that's being formed, it's inherently difficult to understand what our current world looks like. And this is because, on the one hand, we're living in it, and we have difficulties getting a distance to it. On the other hand, we are also surrounded by information about how we should perceive it. Not the narratives, the term you used, the myths, how we perceive ourselves, the identities that we have, the narratives we live in, the ways we try to understand what's happening, what formed us, and what moves us. And some of these narratives, these propagandists, some of these narratives are influenced consciously by certain actors who would like others to perceive things the same. Other things are influenced because people just honestly, seriously have very different ways of viewing the same thing. And we are in a constant 8 billion individuals process of trying to jointly understand what is happening and make sense of it, right? So I view this as a natural process. Some of this process is more guided than others. I mean, we know that there are interest groups in the US, in Europe, in Russia, in China, who will spend money in order to have their interpretation of the world distributed and believed by others, because still, like, belief and mass belief carries a lot of weight. Alex, you're studying the Inquisition and a moment in history when people burned other people because they believed that they were doing magic. And they were very serious people, right? They were in like garments and so on. This was the world. This was reality. People would tell you that magic is real. And you could tell us a lot about magic and what that actually meant. But it's just important to remember that we are such a dumb species that it's usually really difficult for us to know what is real and what is imagined. And let's not even just try to define the term real, but that, we are caught in our own ways of understanding the world constantly, and it's really, really difficult for people in that world, that includes us, of course, right now, to discern what makes sense from what doesn't, or what is beneficial from what is not. Because these people had good reasons, right? I mean, we have to burn these witches because they will poison the wells and kill us all, right? So basically got to get rid of them. I mean, makes sense. And 600 years ago, we would have had a lively debate on whether that's important or not, and then I would have been burned at the stake. So it's just important to recognize that also for us, we're not out of that. We have these awesome technologies, we have this awesome AI, we have awesome internet, we have developed all of this, including projectors and so on, but we're still the same flawed individuals that need to make sense of the world that they live in. Overall, sense-making is very tough, and it often also includes the willingness to recognize inherent contradictions. I don't think contradictions are something that we need to get rid of, but more recognize that it is there. And when it comes to neutrality, some of the contradictions are that on the one hand, neutrality is the act of maintaining peace with belligerents. On the other hand, it is the act of accepting war that is there between the belligerents, right? And we could talk more about that, but because if you buy my concept, if you buy my way of putting this as a triangle, then the natural consequence is that war is and conflict is part of the system. Is not something that neutrality will get rid of, or that neutrality is geared against. It is something that's heavily baked into the entire idea of neutral actors in the international system. When neutrality succeeds, it maintains peace. But when neutrality fails, the consequence is war. And it can fail in several ways. Neutrality might have to be defended, and in extreme cases that might even include weapons. And fun fact, under international law, if a state declares its neutrality and then a belligerent tries to go over the neutral's territory, either flying over it or with troops, then the neutral has the duty to make sure that doesn't happen and has to repel these forces by force. And that itself is not an act of war under international law. So, but those are details. It's just, you see what I mean. It's like you cannot get the contradictions inherently out of the system. So it's probably better to accept that contradictions remain and explain why they're there. And at the end of the day, I will not read the left one, but their propaganda has always gone hand in hand with neutrality, because usually belligerents try to do very heavy propaganda, especially on the space of neutrals, because that's where you still can win. You can win over others, and you can create structural powers. Edward Kors and Marta Cabrera wrote a beautiful book about it. I interviewed them on my channel, and this is maybe the last thing I want to say about this channel. One of the things it allows me to do, because it grows, and I have these discussions about geopolitics, and I get more and more viewers. I'm now at a point where I can even take a boring subject like neutrality and just shove it down the throat of my viewers, and it will never get watched as much as the other videos, but it will get watched a few thousand times. And I'm very happy about that. And this is like, structural power that you can use on the internet. And I'm very glad and happy and grateful for the community it builds, because Dennis reached out to me because you watched some of my videos, we talked, you were on the channel, we get to have a discussion and a debate, and I do think ultimately the best tool against propaganda is rational debate, because propaganda lives off stupidifying reality. Everything needs to be easy and dumb. Russia is evil, Ukraine is good, China is evil, United States is good, NATO is good. And it's like, it's dumb and simplistic. So the greatest act of resistance and of civil disobedience is actually to reject the stupid versions of reality and keep thinking. So I'm glad when we can think together and resist the temptation to dumb down reality. Thank you very much.